He had just landed back from an exhausting boardroom war, his phone still buzzing with urgent calls, his mind still filled with numbers, contracts, and deals worth billions. But none of that mattered in the moment his eyes caught sight of her, a little girl, no older than 10, standing at the edge of the sidewalk with her head down. Her shoes, old and worn, hung loosely on her feet, the laces dragging on the dirty pavement. Other kids, dressed in better clothes, laughed as they passed her, mocking her, pointing at her, treating her with the cruel indifference of children who don't know the way to shame. The billionaire used to people lowering their voices when he entered a room, used to chauffeurs opening doors and assistants rushing with solutions. Stopped walking. Something inside him froze. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man of fortune or influence. He felt like a father, like a human being watching an innocence crushed under laughter. The world around him seemed to blur. The horns of cars, the endless chatter crowd, even the constant vibration of his phone faded into silence. All he saw was her. Without hesitation, he walked over. People gasped. Some even raised their phones to record, but he didn't care. He crouched down, his tailored suit brushing against the dust of the street. And then he did something nobody could have predicted. He gently reached for her untied shoelaces. His massive hands that signed billion-dollar agreements and reshaped entire industries, now fumbled carefully with the fragile strings of a child's worn sneakers. He tied them once, then double-knotted them to make sure they wouldn't come undone. The girl lifted her eyes slowly, almost in disbelief. No one had done this for her in years. Not her teachers, not her neighbors, not even her absent father. She stared at him with wide, trembling eyes, her lips parting as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. And then, as he tightened the knot, he noticed it. Her eyes weren't just filled with gratitude. They were filled with something else, something deeper, heavier, a sorrow far too big for someone her age. The billionaire felt a lump rise in his throat. Why would a child's eyes carry that kind of weight? Why would tying his shoelace feel like unlocking a hidden vault of unspoken pain? Around them, the crowd whispered. Some smiled warmly at the rare display of humility. Others mocked quietly, not understanding why a man of his stature would stoop so low. But he wasn't listening to them. All his focus was on the little girl in front of him. And then it happened. A single tear slid down her cheek. Silent, fragile. It fell not because of the mocking kids, not because of her untied shoes, but because she was carrying a secret she could no longer keep hidden. And in that moment he knew this was no ordinary encounter. This child had something to reveal, something that would shake the very foundations of his life. As he tied the final knot, he whispered gently, almost like a father would, "There you go, safe and tight." But his voice broke slightly, because deep down he could feel it. Whatever she was about to say next would change everything. The girl took a shaky breath, her hands clutching the edges of her worn jacket. She looked at him as if gathering the courage to finally speak the truth, and with the world holding its breath, she parted her lips and began to reveal the secret that would leave the billionaire speechless. If you've ever laid next to someone who made you feel completely alone, then maybe this story isn't just mine, it's ours. And if that's true, subscribe, because stories like this deserve to be heard by those who understand. The billionaire remained crouched in front of the girl, his hand still lightly brushing the worn laces of her sneakers. But his heart was pounding as if he had just stepped out of a battlefield. He had no explanation for why this encounter, so simple, so ordinary on the surface, felt like a turning point. Maybe it was the way her tiny shoulders trembled beneath her faded jacket, or the way her eyes, far too old for her age, seemed to beg for someone to finally listen. He swallowed hard, waiting. The world around them seemed to shrink, the curious crowd now nothing but a distant blur, their whispers fading into a low hum. All that existed was him and her, a man who had everything and a child who seemed to have nothing, yet carried within her something so powerful it could silence his fortune and strip away every layer of arrogance he had ever worn. Her lips quivered as she opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked down at her shoes, now neatly tied, and then back at him. For a moment, she hesitated, as though she feared the weight of her truth might crush the very man kneeling before her. The billionaire leaned closer, lowering his voice, softening it in a way few had ever heard. "It's all right," he whispered, his eyes meeting hers. "You can tell me." And then, with a voice so fragile it could barely rise above the sound of wind, she spoke. "My mother said you would never know me." The word struck him like a lightning bolt, his chest tightening as though the air itself had betrayed him. He blinked, confused, certain he had misheard. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice trembling for the first time in years. The girl's small hands clenched into fists, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. "She told me I should never try to find you, because you'd be too busy, too important, too rich to care." His breath caught in his throat. The crowd gasped, sensing something monumental was unfolding, but the billionaire no longer heard them. Every syllable the girl spoke was a dagger, slicing through the carefully built walls of his existence. He could feel his pulse racing in his temples, his vision blurring as memories he had long buried clawed their way back to the surface. Nights of reckless youth, a fleeting romance, a promise he never kept. The realization sank in slowly, painfully, but with absolute certainty. This wasn't just a child. This wasn't just chance. This was blood. His blood. The girl's tear finally fell, splashing against the dusty sidewalk. She said, "You'd never look at me the way you're looking now." The billionaire's hands shook as he reached for her, his voice breaking. Who is your mother?" The child's trembling lips parted, and the name she spoke was one he had buried in silence, locked away in the vault of his past, never expecting it to return. The moment her words pierced the air, he staggered back, as though the truth itself had the power to shatter everything he had built. And in that instant, the man who commanded empires and bent markets to his will suddenly realize his world was no longer his own. It belonged to her. And whatever came next would not only change his life, it would test every part who he thought he was. That I don't care about algorithms. I care about the people listening to this who are bleeding silently like I did. If you've ever held back tears just to protect someone who didn't protect you, subscribe. You don't have to do this alone anymore. The billionaire's breath grew shallow, as though the very air had thickened into chains around his chest. He had lived through boardroom wars, hostile takeovers, and scandals that could crush ordinary men, but none of them had prepared him for this moment. The girl's voice was trembling, but every syllable she spoke carried the weight of destiny. And then it happened. She whispered a name, a single name. It wasn't just any name. It was a name that haunted his memories when he allowed himself to remember the boy he once was. The name of the woman who had once seen him not as a billionaire, not as a future tycoon, but simply as a man. A young man with dreams, with flaws, with vulnerabilities. The name of the only person who had ever truly known his heart before he armored it with wealth and power. His knees weakened. He felt himself stagger backward, his balance nearly giving way. The crowd that had gathered sensed something monumental, and their chatter fell into silence. The billionaire stared at the girl as though she were a ghost from his past made flesh. His lips parted, but no words emerged. The child looked at him with a mix of fear and defiance, as though daring him to deny her existence. Her small fists were clenched tightly, her shoulders squared, yet her voice trembled as she repeated the name, louder this time, making sure he heard it. And he did. It reverberated in his skull, echoing against the hollow chambers of his conscience. He remembered that night, the night when he left her mother. He remembered the promises he broke, the calls he never returned, the letters he never sent. And now here she was, a living reminder of what he had abandoned. The billionaire's throat tightened, and for the first time in decades, tears threatened to break past the dam of his pride. He whispered the name under his breath, as if saying it aloud would make the past more real than he was willing to confront. His voice cracked, so faint it almost disappeared into the wind. "Her mother, she told you I wouldn't care?" he asked, his tone broken. The girl's eyes, glistening with pain, locked onto his. "She said you would never even remember her. Or me." The billionaire fell silent, and in that silence, everything he thought he knew about himself began to unravel. He realized his fortune, his power, his empire, all of it meant nothing if it failed in the most basic duty of all, being there for his own blood. The crowd, though still watching, faded in his perception. It was just him and this child, his child, standing in the ruins of his carefully built identity. His voice, hoarse and uneven, finally escaped. I remember her. I remember everything. And I remember what I lost. The girl's face softened for just a second, but then hardened again with suspicion. She wasn't ready to forgive. She wasn't ready to trust. And in that hesitation, he understood something even more terrifying. This wasn't just about reunion. This was about redemption. Redemption he wasn't sure he deserved. And in that moment, as his world shook beneath the weight of truth, a single thought burned in his mind. How do I make her believe me? How do I win back what I abandoned long ago? But before he could even form his next words, the girl took a step closer, her tiny voice cutting through him like a blade. Then prove it. If this sounds like your life, stop pretending you're fine. Stop hiding it like I did. Subscribe, not for me, but for every person who thought they were crazy until the truth finally shattered them. You're safe here. We see you. The billionaire stood frozen, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. He had faced senators, rival magnates, and ruthless negotiators, but the gaze of this small girl undid him in ways no opponent ever could. Her words and prove it were not just a challenge. They were a sentence, a verdict on a lifetime of absence. The weight of his empire suddenly felt meaningless. What was the point of skyscrapers that carried his name if a child who carried his blood didn't believe in him? What use was wealth if it couldn't buy back trust or erase years of neglect? His mind raced through 1,000 possibilities, gifts, promises, words rehearsed in boardrooms, but each crumbled before they even left his lips. Because what she wanted wasn't money. She wanted truth, and truth couldn't be written on a check. The silence between them stretched. The crowd leaned in, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. The billionaire lowered himself again, so his eyes were level with hers, as if kneeling not just before a child, but before the judgment of his own past. "What do you want me to prove?" he asked, his voice breaking like glass under pressure. Her eyes flickered with a storm of emotions. Pain, defiance, a hint of longing she tried desperately to mask. She pulled out a small, worn photograph from her pocket. Its edges were frayed, its surface creased from years of being folded and unfolded. She held it out with trembling fingers. It was a picture of her mother, the woman he had once loved, the woman whose name had shattered him only moments ago. In the photo, her smile was soft but weary, as though she carried secrets too heavy for her heart. "She told me you would never care," the girl said, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "She said men like you don't remember women like her. But I remember everything she told me, and I want to know if you remember her too." The billionaire's throat tightened. Memories came flooding back. Nights when the world was simpler, when he wasn't yet a titan, when he was just a young man who thought love could be enough. He remembered the scent of her hair, the way she laughed even when the world was cruel, the promises they made in whispers under flickering streetlights. And he remembered walking away, choosing ambition over affection, greed over grace. His fingers shook as he reached for photo, but he hesitated, afraid that touching it would burn. He whispered her name, not just once, but again and again, as though invoking a prayer to summon forgiveness from a ghost. The girl watched, searching his face for lies, for any crack that would reveal this was just another performance from a man used to getting what he wanted. But she didn't see lies. She saw a man stripped bare, more vulnerable than the powerful figure the world admired. "I remember her," he whispered hoarsely, "more than anyone knows. And I never stopped." The girl's lips quivered, but she did not smile. She only asked, cold and sharp as a blade, "Then why weren't you there?" The question hit harder than any market crash, harder than any loss he had ever endured. He wanted to speak, to explain, to defend himself with tales of pressure, of deals, of sacrifices made in the name of survival. But he knew excuses would mean nothing. All she wanted was an answer he couldn't give. For the first time in his life, the billionaire felt powerless, truly powerless. And in that powerlessness, he realized that proving himself to her would not be done in one night. It would be a war waged in small, quiet moments that followed, moments where he would either step forward as a father she had been denied, or step back into the abyss of man forever defined by his failures. As he knelt there, Staring into the child's eyes, he whispered a vow not just to her, but to himself. I will prove it, even if it takes the rest of my life. And in that vow, the crowd around him disappeared, leaving only the sound of his trembling voice and the unspoken promise hanging heavy in the night air. But the girl's silence reminded him of one haunting truth. Vows were easy to speak. Proving them, that would be the hardest battle of all. The vow had left his lips, trembling and raw, but the air around them seemed to hold it captive. For a moment, there was silence, thick, unbroken, suffocating. The billionaire's chest rose and fell as he stared into the girl's unflinching gaze. Then he became aware of something he hadn't realized before. The eyes. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. Strangers would pause in their hurried steps, employees in press uniforms, travelers rushing to the terminal, all frozen, all watching this strange collision of worlds unfold like a scene too powerful to ignore. The whispers began first. They were faint, like the rustle of leaves before a storm, but they grew, spreading like fire. Some recognized him instantly. The titan of industry, the man whose face graced magazine covers, whose decisions swayed markets and shifted economies. Others did not know his name, but they recognized something else. Power brought low. A man who seemed untouchable, kneeling before a child whose eyes carried a truth that money could not silence. Is that really him? Someone murmured. It can't be. Look at him. No, it is. That's the billionaire. The girl heard the voices too, but she did not flinch. She stood steady, her small frame carrying the weight of the story too large for her years. Her hand still clutched the photo of her mother, the silent proof that this moment wasn't spectacle. It was reckoning. The billionaire felt their stares like daggers. For years, he had commanded rooms with his presence, demanded respect without uttering a word. But here, in this charged silence, respect was not given. It was stripped away. The crowd wasn't applauding his empire. They were judging his soul, and for the first time, he realized how small he truly was. Some faces in the crowd softened, tears gathering as they watched the child hold him accountable in ways no shareholder ever dared. A woman pressed her hand to her mouth, whispering, "That poor girl." A man in security uniform wiped his eyes, whispering, "That poor man." Everyone saw the tragedy, but no one truly knew the depth of what hung between them. The billionaire tried to speak again, but his voice cracked, collapsing under the weight of all those years and all those eyes. His words failed, and so he did the only thing left to do. He stayed kneeling. His silence became his confession. The girl's gaze flickered to the crowd, then back to him. Her jaw tightened, and in that moment, she realized something she hadn't before. She wasn't invisible anymore. All her life she had felt small, forgotten, pushed aside in a world too loud to hear her cries. But here, in this crowded terminal, her voice was the only one that mattered. Her truth had bent the world to stillness. The billionaire's body trembled, not from fear of the crowd, but from the dawning realization that this was no longer about him alone. It was about her, about the story her mother had left behind, about the proof she demanded, and about whether he would rise to meet it or collapse under the weight of failure. The murmurs grew louder. Phones appeared, recording the scene, capturing forever the sight of a billionaire brought to his knees by a child who carried his past. He could feel the headlines writing themselves, the images spreading faster than he could contain. But even that didn't matter anymore, not compared to her eyes, not compared to the truth hanging between them. The girl finally spoke, her voice cutting to the noise like a blade. "You say you'll prove it, but they're all watching. And so am I. Don't lie to me." The crowd fell silent again. The billionaire bowed his head, a single tear slipping free, staining the cold floor beneath him. His answer didn't come in words. It came in the tremor of his shoulders, the rawness of his breath, and the quiet promise he was still trying to summon the courage to keep. And as the girl turned her back to him, taking a single step away, the billionaire realized with piercing clarity. If he let her walk now, if he let her leave this place without showing her the truth, he would lose her forever to you've come this far. That means something. You felt this. You lived it. Maybe not this exact story, but your own version of it. So if you're still here, still breathing under the weight of something they'll never apologize for, hit subscribe, because no one should walk through this kind of betrayal alone. And if no one else says it, I will. I'm glad you're still here.